So I am Michael Allison, the developer of the Play Zone, which is a unique application of polyvagal theory to resilience and performance. And today, I would like to talk to my friend and colleague, Shane Cervantes, who is a fitness trainer and a health coach of 16 plus years.
Yeah, long time.
And what we'd like to sort of rap about is nutrition and eating and all of that, but from a polyvagal perspective.
Yeah.
So Shane, in addition to being a health coach, is also getting into polyvagal theory, and I thought it would be really interesting to take his he's really studied a lot in the world of nutrition, and I thought it'd be really neat to share with the polyvagal world a little more insight into what's going on nutritionally, metabolically, from that perspective.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this. This is gonna be fun.
Absolutely.
So Michael and I have been rapping about this for a while through the lens of polyvagal and through the lens of his performance coaching. And so we just thought it'd be fun to just kind of get into it and like conversationally about how we are viewing nutrition now. Not the specifics of what kind of nutrition you should get into yourself, because that's obviously very personalized and dependent person to person, but more the broader scope of diet, health, nutrition through the polyvagal lens, right? So
exactly. So let's start with a lot of people that we see, and we're also going to frame this in the world of coaching, because we're all coaches in some shape or fashion. And often what we see is we see a client who comes in who's highly mobilized, who's locked in what we would consider a mobilized threat response. And so what's really going on in the body, in the digestive system, that would be really relevant to sort of understand when someone's approaching us as coaches, locked in a highly mobilized threat response. What's really going on?
Good question. So what we believe is going on through a lot of study and conversation is when we're mobilized, right, we're bringing out stress chemical, cortisol, adrenaline, and if we're constantly in a mobilized state, we're constantly feeling the effects of those two hormones, right? And so what would that do on a broad scope? It would dampen our immune system. It would increase the release of glucose from glycogen in our muscles and liver. That would in turn spike our blood sugar. That would in turn spike our insulin to then mobilize that glucose into our cells for energy. And it would also slow our gut motility, how fast food is moving through our digestive tract. And to me, I think that all makes sense, right? If you're mobilized, if you're under some kind of threat response, your body isn't going to want to use its immune system at a high rate because it needs to push that energy in other places, and you're not looking to heal in that moment.
Right.
Obviously you're mobilizing energy because you need it in that moment, whether this is perceived stress or actual stress, right, from being chased by something. And obviously, the next step there would be to push that energy into your cells to be used. And then the last piece is the gut motility piece, which is, I think, very important for a lot of aspects. But obviously, we're not going to want to process food in that moment or in that extended moment, because that's just not what's going to keep us alive right then and there.
Right.
So I think that's all kind of a natural process.
So let's go on then. So where does that lead? So let's say we've been locked in a mobilized threat physiology. Our moving of our food and digestion and elimination are now slowed. We are living in a heightened, a body that has higher levels of cortisol, adrenaline, all of the stress hormones. Where does that go?
Good question. So where it goes is long term, right? Long term, we're going to have an overtaxed inflammation system. So we're going to be living in that chronic inflammatory state, which I think most of us have heard about now, especially in the health world, where chronic inflammatory state leads to all the diseases that we're dying of now: cancer, heart disease, diabetes, etc. Right? All of those big diseases we're trying to avoid, right? So that chronic inflammatory state leads to those. the other thing that it's going to do, and this is more from the nutrition lens, is when you are under that long-term inflammatory or threat response, your body tends to, I think you can think of this common sense-wise too, tends to lean towards fast digesting processed foods because we're, like I said earlier, we're mobilizing that glucose.
Right.
And so we need to replenish, we need glucose to live. That's just part of the deal, right?
Right.
But we also need to store it and use other fuels, ketones, fat, as fuel as well if we're more regulated, right? But if we're under a threat response, we're mobilizing glucose. So of course our body's going to be vigilant to find
which would be behind some of the cravings.
Exactly.
Right? So we're going to find ourselves being drawn to simple carbs, sugars, more processed foods because they turn into glucose more readily.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that makes sense common sense-wise too, which
Absolutely.
I think is important to talk about and think about because so many people live under this kind of situation internally, right? And they don't know why they can't get out of it.
Exactly. And then they feel guilt and shame and weak in that they don't have the discipline to stop eating the sweets and the carbohydrates when in reality, the body is needing that. It's literally saying to the brain, I need this in order to keep fueling the defense, the threat, the mobilized physiology.
Exactly.
Right. And then on the flip side of that, so now you have a body that's mobilized in threat, and now you're having to feed it more sources of sugars and things that can continue to mobilize the threat, which then lead to inflammation, systemic inflammation, which then is an internal cue back up to the brainstem, right? The vagal afferents coming back up saying, threat, danger. So you're getting locked in this vicious cycle.
Yeah, and I think that's where all this leads to, and what we've talked about so much is it leads to this underlying physiology of threat. Which creates this vicious circle.
Yes.
Which, like we've talked about so many times, that is so important to be conscious of as someone who's trying to change because of the shame aspect, the willpower aspect that we know isn't real. Isn't the thing.
It's not that you don't have enough willpower. It's not that you don't have enough discipline. The body is actually doing what it needs to do based on that internal cycle that's been created. And so one powerful portal in then is changing the nutrition. However, that brings us to the next thing that we really wanted to talk about is how do we make changes that will not be now taken as another threat cue subconsciously to the body, right? Because if we come in there now and we say, okay, no carbohydrates, you've got to fast for 18 hours, and we start making these drastic changes, those changes in and of itself, psychologically, emotionally, but also physiologically, because they're interrupting what now the body has sort of created as its way of feeling safe. That's the key point here, is the body is locked in threat, but because it's sort of retuned into that, it's now retuned to almost believe that is safe. That is what's keeping the body safe. And now we're coming in trying to interrupt it, but we have to do that very skillfully and very slowly.
Yeah, that's definitely how we look at it, what we believe. But like, it's an interesting thing to think about that. Like, and this is kind of our theory, I guess, but to think about, even though we consciously know that maybe this physiology isn't good long term, that's evolutionarily, we know that's not how the body really thinks about it, right? We're actually surviving in that moment.
We're alive.
We're alive. We're good.
Absolutely.
So at some level, we are safe.
We're okay.
Right? At some level.
Right.
But we also know now that we want to live 80, 90.
We know it's going to ultimately lead to problems, and we also know that it isn't thriving in the moment. However, evolutionarily, it is surviving.
Yeah, and so I think that's important to just be aware of as well. Like we were talking about earlier, the shame and guilt aspect of eating, but it's also important to be aware that, like, although you may not be thriving, you are surviving. So again, your body is cueing you to not really change.
Exactly.
Right? And so to kind of get into what you're talking about, I guess the next step is like, how do we make people feel safe to change? And as we've discussed, we think that the most likely scenario to inspire some changes to make the smallest change possible in the beginning and then build step by step. And why is that?
And maybe even give them a few choices and to ask them if we have these 2 or 3 choices, what feels safest to your body? What feels like the least drastic change, or what feels like that would actually be easy to incorporate?
Yeah, I agree. And I've done that with people, is to actually ask. It just depends on your relationship, I guess,
Right.
with your client or your person, but to actually ask, and if they are safe enough with you to feel how these changes are being internalized, right? And if they can be honest with themselves about how these changes you're proposing are being internalized, then you can make a better decision on where you want to go.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think that's definitely part of the safe coaching.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. And I think we've done this sort of naturally too. So in addition to helping people with nutrition, often we first start with people who come to see us with fitness, with movement. And so fitness and movement, and then adding in other lifestyle changes, new habits and behaviors, are often easier to start with than going into the nutrition. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think that one way that I've thought about it is because of how deeply connected, how many neural connections between our brain and gut through the vagus.
Yes.
Like there's something like 500 million neural connections, right? So how deeply, literally, we are connected, brain and gut, like changes to our diet might be one of the scariest things we could do.
Absolutely.
I mean, seriously.
Absolutely.
And if you go maybe a little finer into it, like the trillions of bacterial cells that are also sending out cues to our body, through our intestines and to our vagus. I mean, you could imagine if you go at a cellular level how scary a dietary change is, especially this polyvagal lens where safety is so important. And like we talked about, if you don't feel safe making a change, and on top of that, as we're talking about now, a dietary change where it seems to be exponentially less safe because we are surviving currently, then you need to be super careful with how you broach these topics.
Which makes me think, this is really interesting, is maybe it's not the best place to start. Right?
Could be.
It's kind of like how I look at really diving deep into someone with trauma and trying to get to the original trauma. I would go out at the back door, and I would do it the same here. I would build resilience and a safe physiology in other ways, and then go after that really foundational piece, as much as important as it is, and what we're talking about, how it's sending those internal cues. You could do everything with mindfulness, breath work, all of these different things, and still not get fully back into safety because of what's going on in the gut, because of what's going on in the diet. But yet, it might not be the place to start.
Yeah, but like you said, it could be those other things, though, like the mindfulness, or the meditation, or sleep, or just de-stressing techniques that you
bring enough safety that now you can start making subtle changes to your nutrition.
Exactly.
Which is really an interesting concept.
It definitely can be, especially in our kind of Western mindset of like distilling things down. Like, this is what I do. I'm a nutritionist. This is how I'm going to change. Well, okay, but if the goal is greater lifestyle change, then maybe you need to step back and take this broader view of how you are going to actually facilitate this change, right? Ultimately, you know that you want them to change their diet because you know that ultimately that's such a foundational piece that might be the most important thing, but that first step
there, right? Because it's feeding that systemic inflammation, and at the same time, they may not be resourced enough. They may be too far from safety that these other resources, these other lifestyle patterns and habits and relationships that we build, just like what you were saying, you have to have that depth of trust as the coach to even get the honest feedback from your client as to what those changes are, how they're actually impacting their body.
Yeah.
Right. So to get there are a lot of other easier pathways in.
Yeah. And, I think that, as if someone's watching this that might as a nutritionist, right? They're like, well, I get to see my person like once a week for half an hour or something. Well, that's the time, or this is the time to rethink about how you maybe approach that half an hour.
Right.
And it may not be all of these things we're talking about, but maybe it's like, instead of meeting in my office today, we're going to go on a walk.
We're going to walk and talk. And
be out in nature, and we'll maybe feel safer that way. Or it might be like, we're going to spend the first 3 minutes of this session, we're going to nose breathe.
Yeah, we're going to focus on breathing and connecting.
Yeah.
Maybe we're listening to pleasant music together.
I mean, this is not how we have thought about coaching in the past.
Yes.
But again, if we're trying to facilitate change, why don't we look at the broader view, the physiology of what's happening internally, right? Then gain the trust, get them to feel safe, and then they feel better about the change.
Exactly. And then their body actually, not only do they feel better, their body is actually receiving the change.
I know that's the cool thing, right?
It's actually receiving it. It's actually welcoming it.
Yeah. And the one little step further is like, it's actually going to just naturally feel better, it's going to facilitate the change, whatever that is, at such a higher level that you'll get better results as well.
One more thing on that I think is really important. It's almost like, this is kind of how I approach habit change too, is coming in around the back way. So instead of focusing on breaking a specific habit, I tend to build what I call the habit of safety. I tend to add more and more habits that bring the body back into safety, whatever those may be, whether it's how we're relating to someone, maybe it's listening to music, maybe it's breathing, maybe it's going on a walk in nature, but I build these habits of safety to ground the body in enough safety that it has the resource to, at least in the harmful habit, when that gets going, to actually take a moment and interrupt it.
I agree.
So it's the same thing for nutrition.
I agree, and it speaks to your great performance coaching and theory that you came up with. It's like, if you can develop enough, I call it space around yourself to allow yourself to kind of go different directions and feel okay with that, but then bring it back.
Yeah.
Like a threshold, enough space, a threshold. Like, yeah, it's.
You have a moment of pause. You have a moment to see and be aware of what's actually going on, that you can now also have the resilience to interrupt, to step in.
Yeah, so that's where I was going. So yes, exactly. Like, that's exactly how I would view it as well. You're developing enough tools to possibly make a mistake, but feel okay, and then come back, right? And that is that performance coaching that you're talking about. It's like, it's the increasing your threshold to make a mistake, but come back to safety quicker, so your body feels good.
Yeah. It's not that you're not good enough. It's not that you don't have enough skill. It's that you're just in that moment in a physiological state that doesn't support your intention, doesn't support your values, doesn't support your goals. And that changes how you relate to it. That changes how you relate to your failures, your blips. You're coming up short. Changes everything.
Yeah, and which is, it's just such a cool thing to think about in the context of your own life, and then in the context of someone's life that you're trying to change. Like, if you can give them a tool to increase that threshold where they can always come back to feeling good about themselves and not put these societal, external, internal pressures on themselves to be perfect, it changes their whole relationship to whatever they're doing. And in the context of what we're talking about is food. And as any nutritionist knows, like, food is one of those categories in life we put a lot of emotional
Don't
stuff.
take out my cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Don't.
Exactly. Oh, I need that bowl of ice cream at night.
Right.
I need that glass of wine to sleep.
Yes.
Do we actually need those things? Of course.
No, but what we're really saying in that moment is what we need is a way to feel better on the inside. We need a way in that moment to actually feel more at ease, more connected, more safe in our physiology in that moment. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I was going. It's like, do we actually need those things?
No.
Like, nutritionally, of course not. Like, we don't actually need those to sleep or to feel whatever we're feeling internally. Like, nutritionally, we're good, probably, with what we're doing. But yes, it's how we attach that emotion to that food. And so that's what we're saying is, like, it gives us the space
to separate from that in that moment of, oh, that's what's really beneath this. That's what's this urge. Oh, I get it. Oh, what else might I do?
Exactly. And that's another piece I was going to go to too, is like just having the awareness and knowledge of what your body is cueing you to do, why you feel the way that you feel, and then the tool to kind of bring yourself back to safety. And it's like, in your performance coaching, which is so profound for athletes, we can apply all this same technique to any other change, because I think with the athletic performance, it's almost the same thing. You're not understanding why you're feeling pressure or you're feeling down, but you know that that's not going to let you perform as well as you want to perform, right? But given the tools that we're talking about, you can bring yourself back to a space where you can perform again.
That's right. You can help yourself. You can help care for your physiology, right? So you can recognize that, whoa, I'm feeling a certain way. It's not really optimizing what I want to do. So how can I care for that physiological change in a way that helps realign my body to support what it is I really want to do? And it's the same exact thing in nutrition. But you said something that I wanted us to kind of go into too.
Okay.
Is so partly why food and the actual act of eating are also tricky is because in the actual moment of chewing and swallowing and tasting and all of that ingestion of food is actually calming. It is actually pulling on the vagal brake and actually bringing on some more ventral control, the actual act of ingesting. Now, the act of digestion is metabolically costly. And so now that raises the heart rate and all of that. And also, we've talked a little bit about in anticipation of the really nice tasting food, we're actually going to have a little bit of mobilization. So you can look at that. So we mobilize a little bit in anticipation. Then as we're ingesting, in the act, we're actually calming and soothing. And then we're in digestion, we're actually mobilizing again. So we've got these interesting things going on, which kind of makes sense as to why people do different things depending on when they're in different states, right? So if someone is kind of more in that shutting down phase, right, we'll often see people who are in shutting down and they don't want to eat, but we'll also see people in shutting down who will want to eat. And so when we look at it through that lens, we can see that act of eating, the anticipation is getting them a little bit of mobility, pulling them out of the dorsal slightly. The act of eating then is bringing on a little vagal control, a little bit of calming, a little bit of safety in an odd way. But then if they're eating sweets and all of that, now it's amping back up. And so again, it's a way out of dorsal because you're mobilizing. And now in the sweets are keeping the blood sugar high, keeping the body, it's almost like a back way of coming out of dorsal, but it's adding a little threat now with the sugar and the sweet and the inflammation.
Yeah.
But it's still evolutionarily being metabolically on guard is safer, would be able to fight or flee versus shutting down and just feigning death.
Yeah, and I think that this probably would take some more study. We've just kind of been rapping about this, but like I think you could take that knowledge and use it as explanations for clients. Like when if you notice your clients mobilized and they panic eat or they stress eat, you could allow them to maybe believe that what they're doing through the chewing, sucking, swallowing is through the actual ingestion process, trying to calm
themselves down. Absolutely.
Right?
So it makes sense.
Yeah.
Again, no more guilt and shame. Just understand what the body is trying to do.
Yeah, and the opposite too. You could use the anticipation of eating food for someone who is more depressed or dorsal as maybe their first little step of mobilizing.
First beginning of mobilizing out of dorsal.
And you could look, like you were saying, you could look the other way too, where if they're really down in the dumps, maybe they're the sucking, swallowing is keeping them where they feel safe in that moment. And I'm not saying I'm exactly right on this, but I think that there is a reason why people are doing what they're doing through food, and these are little explanations for why they're doing those things, right?
Which again comes out of that feeling as though you're just weak, or you don't have enough willpower, or you don't have enough discipline, and they just have more discipline than me, and I don't have that, right? It changes how you relate to your inability to change your nutrition, or your struggle to stick to something that you know is healthy, or your midnight sweet tooth, whatever it is. It just takes that edge off.
Yeah, and like I was saying a second ago, I think just having this knowledge and being able to internalize a little of this knowledge allows you to feel better about yourself, feel safer within your body, calm your physiology, and again, raise your threshold, give you space, however you want to call it, to possibly make a mistake and not let that mistake spiral. Because that is something that we all know, whether it's exercise, nutrition, whatever change we're trying to make. When people are not feeling good about those changes, they will use the negative to continue going down that negative path, as opposed to being like subconsciously, as opposed to being, well, I missed a day of exercise, that's okay, I'll do it again, I'll do it tomorrow, feel fine. Oh, I ate a cookie, didn't want to do that, so I screwed up, and now I'm going to eat the whole bag. So if this knowledge gives people the space or an increased threshold to make mistakes and feel good and come back to safety, then we've effectively caused some really important change.
Beautiful.
Yeah.